This is Puff Pastry 101, the comprehensive guide to making 3 different types of puff pastry. You've got classic, inverse, and Viennese. I'm going to show you how to make all 3, the key things you need to look out for, and the difference between them. Now, it's a long one, so buckle up. We're going to start with the classic puff pastry because we want to build the fundamentals, and it has 2 elements, the de trempe, which is the dough, and the bourrage, which is the butter. I'm going to kick it off with making the de trempe. So the dough, we've got plain all-purpose flour, a bit of salt, unsalted butter, and then water and vinegar. Vinegar, very important. It's going to help relax the dough and make it easier to roll. We add the butter into the plain flour and the salt. We just mix on a low speed until the butter breaks down and the mixture looks sandy. It should resemble this sort of consistency. And with the mixer on, we're going to add in that water and vinegar just until it pulls together to form a dough. And get this out onto your work surface. Just gently knead this all together to form a dough. Very lightly flour it, and we're going to use a rolling pin to roll it into a rough rectangle. The reason the size of this dough is important is because we're going to make the butter block next. And the dough needs to be the same height as the butter block, but about double the width. That will make the start of the turning process much easier. We need to chill this now for at least 3 hours or ideally overnight. So now it's time to make the bourrage, the butter block. So remember, we just rolled out that classic dough and it's roughly 35 centimeters wide by 20 centimeters tall. So that means our butter block needs to fit snugly in the center. So we need to roll it to about 20 centimeters high by about 17.5 centimeters wide. A great way I find to practice this is to draw a little square like that, flip it over so that we're not getting the ink on the butter, and then we're going to place our squares of butter inside this drawing. Get it in there as best you can, don't worry if there are a few edges. And what we're going to do is fold up this paper, almost like we're wrapping a present, so that we create a nice neat square. I actually like to use a little bit of tape just to keep the paper in place. This would be unacceptable for wrapping a present, but it's fine for a puff pastry block. Flip it over. And all we do is take a rolling pin and roll the butter to the edges of the paper. Because we've wrapped it into a nice neat parcel, the butter can't go anywhere and it will form a perfect square. What you'll end up with is a very neat block of butter, which is extremely even and it fits very snugly into your dough like that. And this makes the whole process so much easier. So we're going to chill this now and then we can come back and we can roll it. So now we need to talk about temperature because temperature is key when you're making puff pastry. None of these shabby recipes online tell you about it. So if your butter is too cold, it's just going to crack as you start to roll it. But if it's too soft, it's going to leak out everywhere. So you need to make sure that when you're ready to roll, your butter is at about 11 to 12 degrees Celsius. And your dough is straight out the fridge, so about 4 degrees Celsius. Then we can go into the rolling process. That will have your dough and your butter at the right temperature, making this whole thing much easier. So my butter and dough are at temperature, so what we need to do is place the butter into the center of the dough. And then we fold the dough around that. And we're going to use our fingers to pinch it together to create a seam. And you see these little edges that I folded over the butter? We use a sharp knife, or I like to use a box cutter to cut these. And this is going to release the tension and make the dough easier to roll. Then we're going to rotate the dough 90 degrees so that seam is horizontal with our body. We're going to roll the dough to give it a little bit of width, then turn it 90 degrees again so the seam is vertical facing our body. Roll the dough away from you into a nice long rectangle. And don't worry too much here about the length of the rectangle. What we're looking for is a thickness of around 7.5 mil, which is 0.3 inches. Then we take a knife and we trim off any of those shaggy ends. Dust off the excess flour and then we perform our first single turn. Now to do this, you fold 1/3 of the dough in and then take the second third of dough and fold this over the top. And now that we've done that, we need to perform our second turn. So we're going to take these edges again, which fold over, and we're going to release the tension by using a sharp knife or a box cutter. Rotate the dough 90 degrees so the seams are horizontal with our body. Roll the dough to give it a little bit of width and then turn it 90 degrees again. We're going to roll it into a long rectangle, and again, don't worry about the length of it. We're just worrying about the thickness here. And then trim off any of the shaggy ends, dust off the flour, and we perform our second single turn. When you've completed your second turn, we chill the dough for 30 minutes and then we repeat the whole process over again. We're going to do our third and our fourth turn. Again, release the tension by cutting the edges, roll it to give it some width, turn it 90 degrees, roll it into a long rectangle, perform that single fold. That's your third turn. We do the fourth turn, chill it for 30 minutes, fifth and sixth turn, chill it, and then your puff pastry is ready. Congratulations, you finished your classic puff pastry. Next, we've got the inverse puff pastry. So what is different about this is instead of the dough being wrapped around the butter, we're actually going to wrap the butter around the dough. Now this makes it slightly more technical, more challenging, and you need to work quicker because that butter block around the outside is going to be a lot softer. Like I said, this is slightly different. It starts with the bourrage, which has butter and flour. Now the flour is very important because that's going to help you to create a butter dough almost, which is very flexible to roll. Then the de trempe has plain flour, all-purpose, salt, water, cream, and vinegar. The de trempe is a little bit of a stiffer dough, so we add the cream and the water over the plain flour and the salt, and then we add the vinegar. Just stir that together until it pulls into a nice dough with no more dry bits. Squeeze it together with your hands and get it onto your work surface. And this is a little bit tough because the dough is quite dry, but we're just going to use our hands to very gently knead it for about a minute until it's slightly smoother. We now need to roll this into a rectangle, but because this is inverse puff pastry, this dough is going to go in the middle, so this needs to be the same size as the butter block we made for the classic puff pastry. And again, use that technique of wrapping it in parchment or this thick plastic, rolling it to the corners to get a nice sharp rectangle. Now this goes in the fridge to chill. For this beurrage, we need to make this slightly softened butter block. So I've got soft butter and I've got flour. We're going to beat that together for about 2 minutes until it forms a nice smooth paste. Once we have our paste, we need to roll it into a rectangle. Now remember, we're going to wrap this around the de trempe. So this is the rough size of the de trempe. So we need to make sure that butter block rectangle is about double the width but the same height. So I'm going to roughly place my butter mixture onto this guide, then wrap it around it with the parchment paper and roll it into an even rectangle. I've rolled it out now. It's a little bit shaggy because I'm using parchment paper, but it's really for illustrative purposes to show you how we're going to wrap that beurrage around the de trempe, and having it at the perfect size is going to make this whole process a lot easier. We chill this now. Before we start rolling, again, temperature is key here. We need to get that butter block to around 9 to 10 degrees Celsius, so it's still cold, but flexible to wrap around that dough. And that dough needs to warm up ever so slightly to around 6 to 7 degrees. Our butter and dough are at the right temperature, and we're going to work quickly and be very liberal with the flouring. So we fold that butter around the dough, cut the edges to release the tension, and then we follow the exact same process as the classic puff pastry. So we're rotating it, giving it some width, turning it 90 degrees again, rolling it into a long rectangle, and then performing 6 single folds. Now, it does probably need to chill after each turn because that butter is quite soft. So make sure you're working with the dough when it is nice and cool. The final recipe is this Viennese puff pastry. Now what's different about this is the dough actually has milk, eggs and butter in it. So it's slightly more enriched, and that makes for a softer and more flexible dough that's, I think, easier to roll, okay, and it'll give you a slightly different type of puff pastry. Okay, so for this, we got the beurrage. Now you're a pro at this. This is the exact same as the classic puff pastry. So I'm not going to show you this again, but the dough, so we've got plain flour, salt, sugar, eggs, melted butter, and milk. Pour all of the wet ingredients in, and then we're going to stir it together to form a dough. You're going to want to get your hands in there to squeeze it together. Then we're going to take it onto our work surface and we're going to knead it for about 5 minutes. Now initially, it's going to look quite dry, but as we continue to knead, it will form a nice, smooth, elastic dough. Once you finish kneading, we're not actually going to roll this dough out, unlike the other recipes, because it's quite elastic, quite soft. It's going to be much harder to roll out. So the best thing to do is to use your hand just to press it to the same height as the beurrage, and then we're going to wrap this, chill it, and we'll roll it once it's chilled. When it comes to rolling out this Viennese dough, it's the exact same process and technique as the classic puff pastry. So once you've mastered that, this Viennese dough should be nice and simple for you. But the only thing we need to do is roll out that de trempe dough because we've chilled it and it's not quite the right size. So we're going to lightly flour it, give it some width, and then roll it out into a long rectangle. Again, roughly 35 by 20 centimeters. Then we can place that butter block in the center once it's at temperature and roll it out just as we did with the other puff pastry. And then once you've done your 6 single turns, you have completed the Viennese puff pastry. So now you've learned 3 different types of puff pastry. You can use them for whatever you fancy. You want to make a millefeuille, you want to make a tarte tatin, they all work. Now I baked them off just to show you kind of the differences. And if you just say, what is the difference, Matt? Well, once you slap it on top of a chicken pie, will you be able to tell? I mean, it's debatable. But for me, the classic puff pastry is just what you would expect, okay? It's buttery, it's flaky. The inverse just melts in the mouth, okay? Just like a puff of air just disappears. And then the Viennese is slightly heavier, but richer. Now, all 3 of the recipes are available on the website. Just head there, check it out. If you've got any questions, let me know. And I really hope you enjoyed.